In the summer of 1314, the largest army England had ever sent across the border marched into Scotland. Nearly 3,000 armoured knights, the medieval equivalent of a tank division, and over 13,000 infantry, a sea of steel and banners sent to deliver a final, killing blow. Against them stood a fugitive king with a force barely a third of their size, a king who had been excommunicated by the Pope, hunted in his own lands, and whose reign began with a sacrilegious murder inside a church. How could this outlaw, this killer, this commander of a hopelessly outnumbered army of spearmen possibly survive, let alone win? This is the story of the 48 brutal hours that decided the fate of a nation. You will witness the ingenious, bloody, and desperate tactics that turned a certain defeat into one of the most astonishing victories in history and forged the legend of Robert the Bruce. To understand the desperation of that summer, you have to understand the 2 decades of fire and blood that came before. The war for Scotland's survival had been a relentless meat grinder orchestrated by one of the most formidable kings in English history, Edward I, a man who called himself the Hammer of the Scots. His armies were professional, disciplined, and ruthless. They had crushed Scottish resistance time and again, leaving a trail of shattered castles and broken armies. By 1306, the Scottish cause seemed utterly lost, a flickering candle in a hurricane. But in the darkness, one man decided to seize a crown, even if it meant drenching it in blood. His name was Robert the Bruce, a nobleman with a strong claim to the throne, but he was not the only one. His chief rival was John Comyn, a powerful and respected lord. On a cold February day, Bruce arranged to meet Comyn before the high altar of Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. We don't know the exact words exchanged, but we know the result. An argument exploded into violence. Bruce drew a dagger and stabbed his rival in the Sacred Heart of the church. As Comyn lay bleeding, Bruce fled, only to send his men back to finish the job. It was an act of outrageous sacrilege, a sin that earned him instant excommunication from the Pope and the undying hatred of the most powerful family in Scotland. Just weeks later, Bruce had himself crowned King of Scots. But his kingdom was a phantom. His reign began as a complete catastrophe. Defeated in battle at Methven, he was forced to become a fugitive, the so-called King Hob, or King Nobody, hunted through the Highlands and Islands by his English and Scottish enemies. The price of his ambition was paid by his family. His wife and daughter were captured and thrown into English prisons. 3 of his 4 brothers were captured, hung, drawn, and quartered. For any other man, this would have been the end. But for Robert the Bruce, it was a brutal education. From this abyss, Bruce clawed his way back. He abandoned the noble folly of pitched battles and embraced a new kind of war, a ruthless, relentless guerrilla campaign. For 7 years, he and his loyal commanders became masters of the shadows. Men like the fearsome James Douglas, a warrior so terrifying to the English they called him the Black Douglas. Douglas waged a campaign of such savagery, famously trapping and slaughtering the English garrison of his own castle in an event so gruesome it became known as the Douglas Larder, that his name alone spread terror. Slowly, raid by raid, ambush by ambush, Bruce and his men reclaimed their country. Then, in 1313, Bruce's impetuous brother Edward laid siege to Stirling Castle, one of the last great English strongholds. Its commander struck a classic chivalric deal. If an English army failed to relieve the castle by Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1314, he would surrender. It was a challenge the English crown could not ignore. The pact had dragged Bruce's shadow war out into the open. He could no longer hide. He had to face the full might of England or lose everything he had fought for. But here's what his enemies failed to understand. The challenge gave Bruce the one thing a guerrilla commander dreams of, the power to choose the killing ground. The new English king, Edward II, was not his father. Where the first Edward was a feared warrior, his son was seen as weak, ineffectual, and more concerned with his court favorites than with war. For him, This was a chance to silence his critics and step out of his father's colossal shadow. He gathered a vast, glittering host. But as this magnificent army marched north, confident in its power, Robert the Bruce was not just waiting for them. He was preparing a trap. South of Stirling, where an old Roman road crossed a small stream called the Bannockburn, he found his ground. The terrain was a weapon in itself. To the west, a boggy marsh. To the east, the steep, winding banks of the burn. The path for a great army was dangerously narrow, and Bruce made it narrower still. He ordered his men to dig hundreds of small, knee-deep pits, like a deadly honeycomb, along the likely path of the English cavalry. These pots, as they were called, were then camouflaged with branches and turf, creating a hidden minefield designed to snap the legs of a charging warhorse and shatter the momentum of Europe's most feared cavalry. The trap was set. Now, he just had to wait for the lion to walk into it. On June 23rd, the English vanguard arrived, a forest of lances and a sea of polished steel. Impatient for glory, they didn't wait to deploy their full strength. A force of heavy cavalry pushed forward. Riding ahead of them was Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew to the powerful Earl of Hereford. Scanning the Scottish lines, his eyes fixed on a single figure mounted on a small grey horse, a simple golden circlet on his helmet marking him as the king. De Bohun saw a target, an irresistible chance for immortal fame. He lowered his great war lance, dug his spurs into his destrier, and charged. The ground trembled as the fully armoured knight thundered towards the lightly equipped king. Bruce's commanders watched in horror. Their king, the linchpin of their entire cause, was armed only with a battle-axe. He was about to be obliterated. But as de Bohun's lance point was inches from his chest, Bruce pulled his small horse sharply aside. In one fluid motion, he stood high in his stirrups, and as the English knight hurtled past, he brought his axe down with terrifying force. The blade sheared through the steel helmet and split the knight's skull to the bone. De Bohun crashed to the ground, dead. A massive, primal roar erupted from the Scottish lines. They had just seen their king, in a single act of supreme courage, fell an English champion. When his men later scolded him for the insane risk, Bruce's only reply was to lament, "I have broken the shaft of my good battle-axe." The psychological impact was immense, but the danger was not over. As the stunned English vanguard fell back in confusion, a second force of 300 knights was racing along the low ground, trying to outflank the Scots and reach Stirling Castle. Bruce saw the move and turned to his nephew, Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, whose division was meant to be guarding that flank. With ice in his voice, the king said sharply, "See, Randolph, there is a rose fallen from your chaplet." It was a stinging public rebuke for his negligence, a stain on his honor. Stung into action, Randolph led his division of spearmen, his schiltron, not to defend, but to attack. He moved his men into the path of the charging knights. The English cavalry, seeing a block of infantry in the open, spurred on, expecting to ride them down. They were about to receive a brutal lesson. The Scots formed a bristling, mobile hedgehog of 12-foot pikes. The English charge smashed into this immovable wall of steel. Horses screamed, impaled on the spears. Knights were thrown from their saddles and hacked to pieces. After a short, vicious struggle, the surviving English knights broke and fled. Randolph had redeemed his honor, and in doing so had proven that Bruce's new aggressive infantry tactics could work. The first day belonged to the Scots, but the main English army was still intact, and that night they made a decision that sealed their fate. Instead of pulling back to open ground, they moved their entire army across the Bannockburn and onto the narrow, marshy plain between the stream and the River Forth. They were now trapped, compressed into a space far too small for their numbers, with a river at their back and treacherous ground on their flanks. They had walked into Bruce's trap and locked the door behind them. Wait until you see what happens next. The morning of June 24th dawned grey and damp. The cramped, exhausted English army assumed they would be attacking a defensive Scottish position. They were wrong. After hearing Mass, Bruce offered any man who had lost his nerve the chance to leave. A great defiant cheer was his answer. Then, in a move of breathtaking audacity that defied all medieval military convention, he ordered his entire army to advance. The Scottish schiltrons, 3 huge bristling rectangles of men and pikes, began to move out of the woods, a walking forest of steel descending upon the most powerful army in Christendom. To the English, it was an unbelievable sight. The Earl of Gloucester, perhaps trying to redeem the previous day's shame, led the English vanguard in a reckless, disorganized charge. The impact was horrific. The charge dissolved against the spear points. Gloucester himself was unhorsed and killed. The battle became a monstrous, suffocating brawl, a push of pike, where the tightly packed English army became its own worst enemy. The thousands of men in the rear ranks, unable to see or fight, simply pushed forward, crushing their own men at the front against the unyielding Scottish spears. For a moment, it seemed the English longbowmen might save the day. They began to unleash clouds of arrows into the Scottish ranks. But Bruce was ready. This was the moment he had planned for. He signalled his cavalry commander, Sir Robert Keith, who led his 500 light horsemen in a devastating charge into the archers' unprotected flank. The bowmen, armed only with daggers for close combat, were slaughtered. In minutes, the greatest weapon in the English arsenal was silenced. This was the turning point Bruce had learned from the bitter defeat at Falkirk years before. The Scottish schiltrons renewed their relentless, grinding advance, pushing the English back towards the Bannockburn. The ground became a bloody quagmire of mud, men, and horses. The English lines began to buckle, and then the final psychological blow fell. On a hill overlooking the battlefield, a new force suddenly appeared, waving makeshift banners and screaming war cries. To the terrified and exhausted English, it looked like a fresh Scottish army arriving to seal their doom. In reality, it was the small folk, the servants, cooks, and camp followers who, seeing victory was near, had grabbed whatever they could and rushed to join the fight. That sudden appearance shattered what was left of English morale. The army broke, all discipline vanished. It was every man for himself. The retreat turned into a massacre. Hundreds were cut down. Hundreds more, weighed down by their armor, drowned in the River Forth, or were trapped in the sucking mud of the burn, where they were easily killed. Recent archaeology has given us a haunting glimpse into this chaos. A lost spur fragment, a piece of a stirrup, and a beautiful gilded cross pendant, torn from a knight's horse harness, were all found near the burn, tangible echoes of that final desperate flight for life. This evidence, uncovered centuries later, confirms the brutal reality of the rout. King Edward II was dragged from the slaughter by his bodyguards. He galloped to Stirling Castle, the very prize he had come to save, but its commander, knowing the battle was lost, refused him entry. The humiliated king was forced to flee south, pursued relentlessly by the Black Douglas. He finally escaped to England by boat, his grand army destroyed, his reputation in tatters. The English losses were catastrophic. Thousands of infantry were slaughtered, and hundreds of nobles were killed or captured for ransom. Scotland had won an impossible victory. The story of Bannockburn is a testament to how brilliant strategy, ruthless determination, and the unshakable will of a people can triumph against impossible odds. It shows how a man, branded a murderer and an outlaw, could rise from the depths of failure to become the savior of his nation. If you are captivated by this story of courage and defiance, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We have many more of history's most dramatic and inspiring stories to share with you. Thank you for watching.